stuff, do not message me. You would find Joseph Zita and send a message to him. Joseph Zita is our Zoom master. Given our large number of participants, we are going to ask you to remain muted. But this is a conversation, and the conversation involves you. And so we do want you to, whenever you want to add a question or a comment from your lived experience in the chat, and I will be summarizing those and feeding them back into the conversation. So as you add those chats, add to everyone so we can all see your great input or your questions. And if you see a question you really like and say, oh, I was going to ask that question, ask it again. Then I'll know that it's a popular question. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Anne-Marie Moeller, who is Windermere United Church's parish nurse. We do have a parish nurse. I always love saying that. And she's going to start us off.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. So my name's Anne-Marie. I'm the parish nurse. I've been the parish nurse at Windermere United Church for 6 years. And some of you might be wondering, what does a parish nurse do? So a parish nurse is a registered licensed nurse with special training in spiritual care. Our role varies, but it's often around health education, health advocacy, referral, and the integration of health and faith together to promote health and wellness. Again, I want to thank our tech team today. Doug, you've met, who's our program organizer, and Joseph Zita and Louise Herhofer, who will take care of any of your technical needs. At this point, I want to introduce two people. One is our minister at Windermere United Church, who's Alexa Gilmour. Alexa's been with us for almost 10 years now. And Windermere is really known to champion causes like social justice, diversity, and inclusion. We're an affirming ministry, and we're proud of that as we celebrate and work for justice for all that are marginalized. And I'd also now like to introduce to you our guest speaker, Professor John Swinton. I met John years ago at a parish nursing conference in Birmingham in the UK. Professor Swinton is the professor of theology and pastoral care, as well as the chair of Divinity and Religious Studies at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. John's published widely on a number of topics, ranging from mental health, dementia, theology, pastoral care, and we're just honored today to have John with us. So over to you, Reverend Alexa.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. And I'm so excited for those on the call who for the very first time are getting to hear the word parish nurse. 6 years ago, we had no idea how meaningful a ministry parish nursing could be. And I invite anybody who has questions about that to talk to us about that, because it's quite special. I wanted to also acknowledge that where I am standing today is the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit, and has been the traditional territory of many Indigenous peoples. It is also part of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and that was a treaty to peaceably share and care for this land, which as a settler, my ancestors have repeatedly failed to do. And part of what we do today is to acknowledge the ruptures and seek ways of living into right relations. And that begins by the acknowledgement. And so we often begin our conversations here at Windermere by that acknowledgement, hoping and trusting that it leads to action. So welcome to each and every one of you. As Doug said, we want you to be part of this conversation, and the way to do that is to type your questions, your comments, your own place where you're coming from into the chat. If you see the question you have in your head already up on the chat, repost it, because that's how Doug's going to know what the burning questions are, is when he sees questions in a certain vein, he'll be raising them up for us in a little bit. But first, I want to invite you all just to take a deep breath in from whatever Zoom meeting you just came from, and to find yourself in this place. Breathe in, breathe out, the wonder of an hour together. Professor Swinton, John, thank you so much for traveling through the airwaves to be with us today. We are grateful to have you here. And I want to actually sort of just jump in with this this question around journeying, not through the airways, but through life. You are a theologian now, founder of the Center for Spirituality, Health, and Stability, but you haven't always been that. And I have heard you describe your life as moments of formation and vocation. And I wondered if you could tell me about that journey.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to having hopefully be an interesting conversation. Yeah. But no, I haven't always been what I am. Well, I suppose that's the case for everybody. But before I wandered into academia, I was a mental health nurse for 16 years, working with people with mental health challenges. And I retrained and worked for a few years with people with intellectual disabilities. And so all of my kind of formative years in these good old days when I was young, were always with people that kind of see the world differently, who had a different perspective on life, who communicated differently very often. You know, people with profound intellectual disabilities communicate quite differently from theologians in the academy, and that difference makes a huge difference. So that was a place that shaped and formed me to think about certain questions and certain things in particular ways. And then when in kind of the late 80s, early 90s, I kind of entered into academia. I thought at first I would end up being a hospital chaplain. My father was a hospital chaplain. Not that hospital chaplaincy is genetic, it just happens to be run in our family for whatever reason. And I did work in chaplaincy for a while, but as soon as I got to university, I knew that I wanted to teach practical theology. And I did, I finished my degrees and I got a job in Glasgow. And then I came back up and had a job in Aberdeen, and I've been here for the past 22 years or whatever. And so I see my nursing and chaplaincy work as a place of formation that shapes and forms me in a particular way. And then my academic work is a place of vocation, where I ask, you know, where was God in all of that? How do I understand these things that I've experienced theologically? And what is the significance of that for the church today and the way that we think about theology and practice today? And so it's like everything else, you know, your life, my life, doesn't make a lot of sense looking back. I can't see the connections. But now when I kind of look around and see the way that my life's panned out, I can see probably there are connections. But even in the times when I wonder about myself, thinking I'm doing one thing. For example, I spent most of my early years trying to be a rock and roll star. I played in bands for years, and I hadn't got two recording contracts, but I didn't make it yet. But now I lead worship. And now I speak for a living, and now I do a lot of things. And so me thinking that I was going to become a rock and roll star, it turns out actually God was preparing me to become a worship leader. You know, so you can make whatever plans you want in life, but your vocation works itself out differently. But that's kind of how I came to be who I am and why.
I do see those connections, and as you speak, I'm certain every one of us was starting to pull some of those from our own lives. And you landed in practical theology, which I love, because I understand that to mean, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that to mean that you like the answers to questions like, what can I do in this moment with this patient, with this congregant, with this loved one that can make a difference to them? And you've also spoken about how good spiritual care, which is sort of the topic of today, that it's not an added competency, that there's actually a fundamental change or shift that we have to make in our language, our attitude towards those who've been diagnosed with a particular disability, but also towards one another, how we interact. So what is it that needs to change for caregiving to become a sacred act?
Yeah, well, there's two questions there. Biblical theology, I think, looks at the interface between theology and the practice of the church and the practices in the world, and tries to ask the question, what's going on and why does theology matter in this situation? Where is God in this situation? So therefore, while it's an academic discipline, it's inevitably going to end up asking the question, where is God in this? And so it's inevitably going to end up in practice. Not all theology does, but practical theology clearly does do that. And so it's always on the alert for where the spiritual is in relation to the practices of both church and world. So it tries to raise our consciousness to that. And now, in relation to practice, in relation to care and practice, that's important. It's important. So, for example, if you think about the creation of the world, so the Genesis account, right? So you've got two accounts of creation. In the first account of creation, God creates human beings and gives dominion over the world, to crush it, to hold it down in its place like that. And we do that, and we do it badly very often. But there's something important there about responsibility for creation. But in the second creation account, something different happens. So God says to Adam, go and care and tend for the world. And so a primal responsibility that's given to human beings is to care and tend for the world. So to be a human being is to care. And a necessary corollary of that is to be cared for. So to be human is to care and to be cared for. So something that's kind of written into creation in that way. And so, for example, and it's really important actually, because when you, for example, come to a point in your life where you can no longer look after yourself or care for yourself, you don't lose your dignity, you don't lose your value. You simply discover an aspect of being human that's hidden very often because we're so dependent in that sense. So care is written in there. And so when it comes to the practice of care, what we're really doing is being faithful to our creation calling, to care for creation, to care for one another, and ultimately to recognize that we're loved in order that we can love. And so practical theology kind of takes that kind of theological perspective and then says, so what does that look like when we engage in caring practices? And so it gives you that perspective, and then we think, well, now, what does love look like? And that really is a question that underpins care, I think.
What does love look like? And you have been exploring that in your latest book with a variety of Christian voices. I'm wondering if one of those sort of illustrates maybe love versus stigma. What does it look like to live into our calling, to care and to be cared for, and to say to someone, you have dignity, you have value, and I love you?
Exactly. Well, the project you're talking about is looking at, I spent the past 3 or 4 years having conversations with Christians who are living with severe mental health challenges. Putting to one side the assumptions that you have about somebody who has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or major depression, and just listen to people's stories, because very often people don't have their stories listened to properly because we're so focused on their labels that we actually can't hear what people are saying. And so it was fascinating to hear the faith stories and the way that faith works itself out in these difficult contexts. And one young man, well, he was in his 40s. Now, the older you get, the younger 40s become. So I'll call him a young man, very young man.
Keep that in mind.
Exactly. So yeah, he kind of, his story kind of illustrates the point that you're making. So his name was Alan, and he lived with enduring schizophrenia, and he told me a lot of things, but he told me the story of when he first discovered that he had schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is one of these labels, names, diagnostic criteria, which is important for mental health professionals to enable them to do their job well, but it's much less important for everybody else because it's highly stigmatized. You know, people make up content, violence, split personality, things that are not true. So he'd been having some strange experiences. He had been hearing voices. He'd been disoriented. He felt that people were against him in a lot of different ways. And so he had been talking to his psychiatrist for quite some time. And eventually his psychiatrist said to him, Alan, I think you've got schizophrenia. Well, they said, I know you've got schizophrenia. And the first thing that Alan said, and this is interesting, he said, I was really disappointed. He says, because I felt that my life was over. He said, I felt that I know, okay, I have to take medication forever. I'm not going to get a job. I'm not going to have a future, etc., etc. None of which is necessarily true, but that came with his understanding of what that diagnosis meant for him. And so he went on his way home, and he got on the bus, and he sat down beside a lady who he'd sat down beside many times. And he told her about his experience. He said, the psychiatrist says I have schizophrenia. And the woman got up and walked off the bus, and they never talked again. And so he was pretty devastated by this. So I went home, and he told his mum this whole story. And he said, Mum, I'm a schizophrenic now. My life is over. And his mum said to him, no, Alan, you're not a schizophrenic. He says, you're Alan, and I love you. You're going to have treatment. You're going to have difficult times, but you're Alan, and I love you. And that strikes me as like almost like a parable of what we're called to do when we are engaging with people who are marginalized through no fault of their own very often. Because for all of us, what's the main thing that we want? We want somebody to say to us, I'm glad that you exist, and it's good that you're here. And Alan's mum just gave him that gift. Simply said, it's good that you exist, I'm glad that you're here. And Alan said that was one of the most healing moments in his time. I mean, it's not difficult, it's not complicated. You just have to recognize the power that you have in giving value and love to somebody in a situation like that.
You make the distinction, and I hear it in this story that you've just told, between inclusion and belonging. What's the distinction for you between those two as we sort of move to be caregivers in the world?
Yeah, well, the difference is that inclusion is a political term. It's a legal term that means that we have to develop policies and laws that make it illegal to prevent certain people from coming into our communities, people with disabilities, or people of other race, gender, whatever that may be. And we need these laws because, unfortunately, people are stigmatized, alienated, and treated very badly. But the problem with inclusion as a legal term is all you have to do is stick to the rules. So in order to, for example, make your church inclusive, all you have to do is have a ramp and make sure that you've got a good sound system. Nobody has to speak to you when you get into that church. Nobody has to care for you, but you've done your duty. Belonging is different. Belonging means that you have to miss somebody when they're not there. So belonging calls for an engagement of the heart rather than simply an engagement of the law. Now you need both, because we need laws to protect people, and that's absolutely great. But we need an engagement with the heart that enables us to want to be with people who are marginalized or who are in difficult situations, not because we have to, but because that's what we do. And if you think about Jesus, he didn't care for people just because he had to. It's just kind of what he did. And we're called to become people who just do that because that's what we do.
When I hear in your story this calling, I also hear how in each one of our own lives, there are people who call this out of us. As a church minister, there's the people I serve, as my own, with my own mild mental health challenges, the places I want to belong, as a granddaughter of someone who's living with dementia right now, and in particular, as an adoptive mom whose 3 children struggle with developmental trauma. I'm particularly moved by what I'm hearing in the stories you're sharing about your reflection on healing being distinct from curing. What Alan's mom did for him was about healing, not curing necessarily. Yeah. And I wondered if you might describe that. What does healing look like for those facing significant mental health challenges?
Well, if we think first of all about the idea of health, so very often, because we live in a kind of highly biomedicalized culture, we have a particular understanding of health, which runs along some derivation of the absence of illness. So in order to be healthy, you need to not have a particular form of illness or disability or whatever it may be. And so therefore, a good medical response to you if you have cancer is to identify the cancerous tumor in your lungs and use medical technology to get rid of it. That's great. Enduring mental health problems, chronic mental health problems, or enduring mental health challenges, where you're always going to be ill. So there's a kind of underlying difficulty with the way that we frame health anyway within Western biomedical systems. But when we turn to the Bible, we see a different perspective. So there's no word for health in that kind of biomedical way. The closest perhaps is the word shalom, which is used many times as peace. But the core meaning of shalom is justice, righteousness, and wholeness. So to encounter shalom, which we could say to be healthy, is to be in right relationship with God. And that doesn't require that you be physically or psychologically healthy. It requires that you are able to help and able to be with God, and even in the midst of the difficulties that you encounter. So you could be somebody who's dying of cancer, and you could be much more healthy than somebody who is an Olympic athlete, who just simply looks after themselves all day long, because that's kind of very often the way that many of us think about our bodies and ourselves. And so that leads to a different kind of understanding of health, which in turn leads to a different understanding of healing. So healing is connection. It's connection with God, connection with self, connection with one another. And that we can be healthy in that sense, even in the midst of very difficult and trying physical and psychological circumstances. And a good example would be, if you think about Jesus' encounter with the woman with the discharge of blood. So she touches his cloak and she's cured, right? So that she no longer has that. And then she has this conversation with Jesus. And then when she's leaving, Jesus says, "Go, your faith has healed you." But she's already been cured, so something else happened. She met Jesus. She began to understand what's in. So healing runs that way. And the important thing there is that if you think about the role of the church in the practice of health and healthcare, that makes a big difference, because it means that we don't have to be therapists or medics. These are very important roles, but we can actually bring something different to the process of healing. And so it gives us confidence that the thing that we bring in the context of health and healing is something that's worthwhile having, without just having to pretend that we're something else, if you see what I mean.
I do, and I hear in that the individual has this role to create places of belonging and sacred caregiving, and the church has this role. And indeed, you've spoken about, I think, how the work that you have been involved in is not just relevant to the individual, but it also speaks to the need for institutions and organizations to recognize that they are also part of creating or crafting a certain spirituality. And why is that important to talk about the spirituality of an organization, be that a church or a hospital or wherever else we are working and living? This importance of cultivating a spirituality of the institution or organization.
Well, all institutions have a spirituality. They have an ethos, they have a way of doing things, a certain belief structure, whether it's a religious institution or whether it's not. And likewise, organizations can become mentally disturbed. So you can have organizations that are depressed, within which everybody is just completely fed up. You go to work every day, but there's nothing like. You can have organizations that are neurotic, that you just get everybody's kind of a bit anxious and nervous, and you're not quite sure about what the future is, and the management don't quite know what to do. And you can have organizations that are completely psychotic. So when you're inside the organization, everything looks great, but everybody looking in knows there's something seriously wrong there. So there's actually a corporate psyche within groups of people when they get together. And there's a corporate spirituality when groups of people get together. And so if you take something like a health service, take something like the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, and you can work it out within your own health service. It's a free health service. It's free at the point of entry for everybody of all faiths and none. So within the parameters of that health service, you can't have particular spiritualities that rule the roost in that sense. You know, you couldn't have a Christian spirituality or an Islamic spirituality or a Buddhist spirituality that everybody had to adhere to. So instead, you have to have a generic or universal spirituality that everybody has. So you very often hear people talking about spirituality being a general search for meaning and purpose and hope and value for all people and none. And that's fine, and that's not a bad thing. So I don't say that derogatorily. But what I would point out is that that kind of spirituality is actually shaped by the system. It's shaped by the parameters of the system that people are working within, which allows certain things and doesn't allow other things. So I think it's always helpful to be aware of the kind of spirituality that underpins your organization, just to make sure that it's flourishing and that it's helpful. Because sometimes that, you know, you get good and bad spiritualities within individuals, and you get good and bad spiritualities within institutions.
Right. This sounds a little bit like what you've worked on around the need to look for thick descriptions rather than just thin ones. And I'm wondering, you know, what makes for a thick description versus a thin description that sort of helps us to shape things more robustly.
Yeah, thick descriptions are really, really important. So a thin description would be, say for you, Alexa. It's funny because I'm actually a bit nervous about saying your name because I have an Alexa at the outside of my office here. I'm wondering what it's going to say.
She might answer for me.
She might do. So a thin description of you, Alexa, would be you're a minister.
Yep.
And a woman.
Yep.
Right? A thick description would be you're a minister of a particular church. You have a history. You have a story to tell. You have a church which people by a group of, you know, certain individuals. So you have this big story that emerges from and makes you you. So if I really think about you as you're a female minister, then I know nothing about you at all. But I do know enough to know, you know, what your social role is. But when I incorporate what I know in that bigger, thicker description, I get to know you better. I get to understand you better. I get to see your community better, and so therefore I can understand. I can empathize more closely and I can listen more carefully to what you're saying. Now, one of the things that dangers within any kind of healthcare situation is that you thin people down to the size of the diagnosis. For example, the cancer patient in bed 44. Oh, he's okay, so he's a schizophrenic or she's a bipolar, whatever it is. And as soon as you do that, you take the whole of their life and reduce it to the size of that particular thin description, and you miss out some fantastic and really important things. So I think we need to think thickly, would be my as carers.
Think thickly. Well, you started to name some things that you noticed about me so far and know from our talk together. And one of the things that you don't know is that I struggle in my relationship with time. I always feel like I never have enough and that there's always something that I'm moving towards. And even in my theological framing, that I have a calling that I have to get to, and somehow I'm failing if I don't get there. But you seem to have learned from your friends and patients with dementia how to become friends with time. Tell me how. What is it to become friends with time?
Well, that's funny. That's interesting. My phone, I should have switched off. I apologize.
Your time is running. Yeah.
Nobody ever phones me. It's just typical. Like, anyway, it's only my wife. Yes. So time is something. Oh,
you could bring her into the conversation if she's got some answers on time.
No, I can't even. I don't even know how to switch my phone off. There we go. Right. So time is something that is shaped and formed by culture. Okay, time exists and we move through it, but actually the way that we discuss time and think about time is shaped by our cultural form. So in a capitalist society like ours, we buy time, we use time, we waste time. Everything that you do with your money, you do with your time. And so time becomes a commodity in the same way as everything else. And as soon as that happens, it becomes oppressive because you're constantly looking to the future. You're constantly onto your next meeting or your next Zoom meeting or your next whatever it is. And you very rarely stay in that space where you sit down and think, I'm here just now. What does it feel like? You know, yeah. And the thing I learned and continue to learn is when you're with people with advanced dementia in particular, that understanding of time is really, really important, because you can't be racing towards the future, and you can't always be trapped in the kind of standard way of understanding time, because in order to be with somebody who is wrestling with certain issues around time and space and language and memory, you need to really be present with them in that particular moment. And so there's that lovely spiritual tradition called the sacrament of the present moment, where you reflect or contemplate the fact that every moment's given to you by God, that every breath you take is given to you by God. And as a spiritual exercise, that takes you into a space where you're listening to people, because when you are with somebody who's experiencing advanced dementia, sometimes there are points of connection. And if you're moving too quickly, or if you're not concentrating, then you'll miss that point of connection. It may be fleeting, but you'll miss it because you'll be too busy doing things. And so the art of doing nothing is a skill that we need to remember. And the art of remembering the time as a gift is something that we, and so you kind of, I don't know whether people with living with dementia gift it to you, but it's something that you learn from spending time with people who are just experiencing things differently.
Thank you. I'm thinking about who we are with and learning with the group that we are with. And so I'm actually wondering about turning this over to Doug for a moment and seeing, Doug, are there questions in the chat? I admit I have been present and focused on John, and I do not know if we have a question that's come up. If not, I've got lots, and
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
happy to chat.
Good. No, I do have a question. And I just wanted, before I get to the question, let you know that we have a number of parish nurses on this call. We also
That's
have
exciting.
at least one person that I recognize from the School of Theology on the call, so I suspect there's others too. And to all those people who are on the call, this is a great time to start putting your questions in the chat or in the Facebook comments over there, and then they get passed on to me. But we do have an excellent question from Facebook, and it comes from Elizabeth. And she asks, how can we shift the discourse around caregiving from one that has often been seen as a burden to one of love?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. And one of the problems, I think, is that caregiving is undervalued within society. And particularly caregiving in relation to, for example, elderly people or people with disabilities, because elderly people and people with disabilities are also undervalued by, and sometimes actively devalued by society. So you've got a really difficult space there, where the gifts that you're giving to somebody, society is saying it's not important, and the people that you're giving to, society is saying it's not important. So, but when you think about it like that, actually caregiving is quite radical, quite prophetic, and quite countercultural. Because if you really feel that your vocation is to give care, give love to people who are marginalized and people who are oppressed, that's a very powerful thing to do. It's quite a countercultural thing to do. But I think theologically, from the perspective of, of the things we were talking about earlier on, actually, it's a very profound vocation. The vocation to care is something that's given to you by God, given to everybody. But for those of us who are in parish nursing or in professional care, it's a special type of vocation that engulfs the whole of your life. Everybody cares, but carers in that context really do have a special responsibility. So I think maybe thinking about how prophetically it's important as a witness to the world, a world which is really pushing against certain things, but also as a specific kind of vocation that you go into this, not just because you quite fancy it or because you're a kind person, hopefully you are a kind person, but because this is something that God wants you to do as part of God's transforming movement within society. So I think if you frame it in that way, that culturally it's prophetic and theologically it's vocational, that gives at least a firm base to feel confident that you can move certain things in a positive direction.
Can I do a follow-up, Alex? I'm hearing all that and this valuing of it, and yet I'm trying to, I don't really have a question, but just we notice how caregivers are struggling in this COVID period, in this pandemic. And I just heard in the news today a woman complaining because she now can't go back in to visit her ailing parent in the home because a caregiver wasn't vaccinated in the home. Everybody in the home had been vaccinated and she was going in, and now a caregiver had not yet got that person's vaccinations. And she's saying, where are the priorities here? Shouldn't the caregivers be getting the vaccinations first? And yet not always happening. I mean, I don't know what your struggles you're seeing through COVID.
Yeah, and Doug, there's actually a question in the chat that came up sort of spiritually at the same moment around, and so I'll throw this in with that, John, and the question from Deborah is, have we learned anything new and specific about caregiving given our experience of COVID? So those feel somehow related, this COVID weight and caregiving and what we've learned.
It's actually a really complicated question because we have a similar issue here, because there are some caregivers who don't want to take the vaccine. And so you have a situation where you can't enforce the vaccine, but at the same time, by not taking the vaccine, exactly the kind of situation that Doug's pointing out about becomes an issue. And we haven't solved that problem at the moment. Because if you try to make vaccine compulsory for caregivers, then you've all sorts of legal and civil rights, quite rightly, issues. But at the same time, if you're quite right, civil stance not to have to take any vaccine actually prevents people from seeing those who they love and from caring well with people, then you have a real ethical dilemma, and nobody's addressed it that I'm aware of. So it just kind of like hangs there. I mean, COVID's raised a lot of complex issues just like that. Yeah. So all I can do is agree that there's a huge problem. But it strikes me that when it comes to the vaccine, loving your neighbor and wanting the best for them and not doing harm to your neighbor is a good motivation for taking the vaccine. Yeah. But, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, you spoke earlier about this profound vocation of caregiving being, I think you said radical, prophetic, countercultural. Have you seen new ways of that radical, countercultural, prophetic caregiving over the last year that you're still sort of muddling through and wondering about? What does it look like now?
Well, the answer to that is yes, but just in a very straightforward way, because what I've seen is the way that nurses and care home workers have had to really battle with horrendous situations and with situations that very often they're not trained to deal with. Large numbers of bereavements, isolation, having to actually leave your family to go and stay in a care home because it's not safe to come back home, and to be overwhelmed by people who are in really difficult physical situations. To be a nurse or to be a care worker just now is admirable. So I mean, I think if you're asking me for special examples, I don't think I would want to do that. I just think that for us in the United Kingdom just now, just simply doing your day-to-day job makes that point, that you're prepared to put your life on the line, and literally is life on the line, for people whom society doesn't value very often. It's pretty profound.
Yeah. I was just speaking to a trauma responder who responds to violent and urgent incidences like train derailments, and we had a horrible situation with a driver in a van going down Yonge Street and murdering people, and he's the first one on the scene.
Oh, yeah.
And never in his 15 years had he been in a long-term care home. And in the last 8 months, he's been in over 20 long-term care homes,
Really?
responding to the needs of the staff.
Yeah.
And providing this sacred space of debriefing, belonging, lamenting. And you've spoken about that. And that's the piece I'm wondering about, the call to the church in this time around psalms and laments, and this great tradition that could be brought in to this conversation we're having globally. I'm just wondering what that raises for you around the gift of the church in that space, in the tradition.
I think there is space for exactly these kinds of spiritual practices, because it's interesting. Both my wife and my daughter are nurses, and so I understand what goes on just now within hospital and how difficult it is. But I also have a number of chaplains who are students who are going through horrendous situations. Like the chaplains are having to function as healthcare professionals very often, as in carers from time to time. So it's very complicated. And so they've noticed a lot of trauma, and they've noticed the need, precisely your point, for people to articulate their grief, their loss, and the lostness. Because when you go to work in a normal day and you come back and 10 more people have died that day, and you go back in and the same thing happens, that's a lot of grief to be able to handle. And so, yeah, the issue of lamentation has certainly come up in relation to hospital chaplains. And so the idea of lament is, how the lament psalms run, that big outburst of frustration, anger, and lostness. God, where are you in the midst of this? But then in the middle of some of the last psalm lament, you get a turn, which the psalmist suddenly realizes the presence of God's unending love. And then the psalmist goes on and praises. But some of the psalms just finish dead. Darkness is my only companion, like Psalm 88. Now, the key thing there is it can be very difficult to articulate that kind of deep trauma. But the Psalms of Lament and the Psalms of Imprecation as well are designed specifically to give a language within your faith structure to the frustration and anger that you feel about being troubled by a situation or hurt by a situation. And some of the Psalms of Lament were designed for small groups who had been traumatized and who would come together and just speak out their trauma in these groups. Now, I don't know of a situation where people are doing that formally, but it seems to me that that would be a very useful spiritual practice for healthcare professionals who are going through this very unusual traumatic experience, as a way of staying in touch with their faith life, but at the same time articulating both anger, disappointment, and fear. So finding that language is important.
Sounds like a good practice for Holy Week next week.
Yes.
The garden experience, the Good Friday experience,
That's right.
And how we could use that gift in our own lament. There was a question about asking you to talk a little bit more about the relationship between suffering and care. And what they asked was, or what they said was, but the relationship between suffering and care, both as a caregiver and the one receiving care, and about the mutuality of the caregiving relationship. That is, that it's not one way, but that the carer has as much to learn and receive. So I think there's a few pieces in there, the relationship between suffering and care, and then the relationship, what you've learned about the mutuality of care.
Well, care is always a mutual enterprise, because very often it's based around stories. and the sharing of stories. You know, so I mean, most chaplaincy work, for example, is me listening to you and you listen to me, and we work through things.
Mhm.
Now, in order for a story to be told, both parties have to tell it. Now, by that I mean, if I'm telling you a story about myself, for example, whether or not I tell you certain things will be determined by your response, by your body language, by your interest. But, you know, so if I'm halfway through my story and you look at your watch, then that's the end of that particular conversation. Exactly. So as caregivers, we're constantly constructing these stories together, and no two caregivers no two people hear the same story in the same way at the same point. Right? So in relation to care and suffering, one of the things that suffering does is it takes away our language. Sometimes it's difficult to articulate, but what it tends to do for those of us who are in the presence of suffering is it makes us want to stop it. And so the temptation is always to stop it, to find a solution for a person's situation, to find a way of dealing with this. And if we can't do that, let's talk about something else. Whereas actually, one of the ways in which we can begin to find healing in the suffering is through being listened to, but being listened to for what we're saying, rather than what the caregiver wants us to be saying in that sense. So in that sense, that conversation is profoundly important, that we need to learn how to bear one another's suffering in that sense, without that sense of being afraid of it. So it's a difficult kind of balance to get to be able to, for me to take on board your stuff without being rejecting your stuff. And so mutuality is inevitable, but the one thing that we do have to be careful for, and this is very much in relation to how we look after ourselves in the midst of suffering or deal with someone else's suffering, is that emotions are transferable. So if you've ever been with somebody who is really anxious, you'll go away and you'll feel really anxious. Likewise, if it's somebody who's maybe a bit flat or depressed, you'll go away flat. So there is that kind of unusual emotional shift in change. So in order to look after yourself in the context of suffering, you need to find a space and a place and a way to deal with that referred emotion. Otherwise, you end up just carrying it around and you'll end up with depression and anxiety or whatever it is. Like, so finding a way to get rid of that anxiety afterwards with it, because you've got to take it on board. Being part of the caring is to take that person's suffering, be it physical or psychological, into yourself, but then you've got to get rid of it. Right? So the mutuality is great because it enhances empathy, but it's also very unhealthy if we don't deal with it properly.
And I know that there's lots of ways and rituals that people can find and look into. I have a mentor who's a nun who works with refugees, and she lives with them. And every night as she goes to bed, she has a practice of handing them over to God. And she says, I'll pick them up in the morning, God. And she just hands them back, you know, their stories, their suffering.
That's a great exercise.
And sleeps, right?
Yeah.
So we have another question here about dementia and time. And as a caregiver, what is helpful for being with someone in their strange way of being in time? So what's helpful for the caregiver when you are with somebody who has a countercultural way of being in time, I think is what's being asked.
Well, respecting the moment is probably the key there. So very often, you know, people with dementia may, for example, become a little bit dislocated in time and think that the present is the past, or that you're somebody from the past who's with them in the present. And the temptation might be to correct that, or to try to draw them into the present. And there's lots of different opinions as to what's good or bad in the midst of that. But to be able to be with somebody, you need to recognize that if they do feel dislocated in time, then perhaps part of your task is to be dislocated in time as well. And in other words, to go with them, to begin to understand what's going on, what's happening with them, and begin to understand what that memory or that experience really does mean to people in that way. So it's getting that into that rhythm of not trying to correct people, but seeing what happens when you enter into that space. And tied in with that, I think, is the kind of issue of memory is a complicated thing, obviously. But one of the things you might have noticed, and people might have noticed, is the way that certain forms of music and certain forms of smell and touch can actually bring memories to the fore for you, but also for people with dementia. Now, with certain forms of dementia, the memory isn't actually lost. It's the connection between being able to, the neural connection that enables you to access that memory that's the problem. So you've got the memory here, but you can't get to it. And sometimes, because the brain's plastic and it's clever, it can oftentimes use different neural pathways. And so sometimes when someone hears music, what happens is the brain readjusts and opens up neural pathways, which actually enable people to access a memory that they couldn't do at any other time. And so for that moment, when you see somebody responding or somebody engaging with that, they actually are reliving that memory. And of course, when you have a memory, you have feelings, emotions, a sense of who you are, a sense of self, a sense of identity, those who you love. And for that moment, that person experiences all of these things. And there's a great beauty in that when you begin to see people in the context of worship, for example, and realizing actually they're experiencing something really, really important. And likewise, or similarly, when somebody's dislocated in time in the way that we've been talking about, in that moment, they may actually be working through issues of identity, thinking through important things that have been important for their life or important relationships. So it's not just that somebody's speaking nonsense or because they've lost themselves in time. There's actually something going on. And so it's worthwhile just going with that, listening, and then thinking through what's really going on rather than what you might think is going on.
I'm hearing in what you're inviting us to, this invitation to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is, the early disciples being taken by Jesus to these places, and the fear that these things might overwhelm, right? The suffering of someone else might overwhelm me, so I will shut it down. Or the confusion my grandmother has might upset me, so I might shut it down. Or the pain that someone has. And we're very good in the culture of inviting people to a myth of we all deserve to be comfortable, and yet where growth is, where relationship is, where that thrives, is in the places of our growing edge. And I'm got a question sort of shaping in my head around the invitation to being uncomfortable, and to discover in that we won't die, right? That our identity will be found, that the sacred moment will show up. And in maybe you can frame this theologically for me or practically for me, but is that correct? Is that an invitation? Am I hearing that in some of what you're saying?
I think one of the things that Jesus did very well was to make people uncomfortable. And he would take day-to-day situations that everybody was pretty well tied into and religious people in particular thought was, they knew exactly what was going on, and they'd say, yeah, but what about that? Yeah, you've got the Sabbath, like, but what's it for? I always think Jesus was a good practical theologian. And it's that dissonance that Jesus causes, that sense of unsettlement that enabled people to see different things. The dissonance in the parables, the way in which, where does evil come from? Well, we don't know that it's scattered in the wheat and the chaff. Like. But in the midst of that, he says, yeah, but somebody planted it there. And you're left thinking, what does that mean? Yeah. And then you think, oh, well, at minimum, it means I've got to be careful because I'm not sure that I know what's good and evil, so I better be careful that I don't mix up the two. And so that kind of dissonance opens up space for transformed thinking. And I kind of think sometimes when Paul talks about having your mind transformed, it's like that. It's like getting a new imagination, get a new idea, and not looking at somebody with dementia and thinking, oh, what a shame. They used to be such a lovely person. Look at them now. Instead of looking at them saying, what can we find in here? What are their hopes for the future? What possibilities have we got? What can we do to move them on in their vocation? Because after all, their discipleship, you don't suddenly stop being a disciple because you have a little bit of brain damage. So what can we do to, what vocation has God got for them now? These are strange questions, like, but don't actually make a lot of sense to many people who don't ask the same questions. But if you begin to ask these kinds of questions about, what does it mean to be healthy when you're dying of cancer, then that opens up a whole new realm of ways of caring for people. Because even in these last moments of your life, you can find meaning and purpose. You can find things that God wants to do, and you find things that you want to do. And then when you're faced with, challenging decisions in life, new possibilities begin to emerge from that. So yeah, it's creating that dissonance, but it's a constructive pastoral dissonance that enables us to care better because we can see more clearly.
Thank you. I know that there's a couple more questions, but we're not going to be able to get to them today. But I am going to encourage everybody on this call. We are going to put up, there we go, we already did the information on the Center for Spirituality, Health, and Disability. If this is your first time meeting John, I'm delighted. You can meet him again and again in all kinds of books that he's written, other conversations that he's had, and of course, in reliving this last hour as you wander from this space to your next space. So thank you very, very much, John. Thank you for the gift of time, the gift of conversation. And to everybody on this call, we are so grateful that you were here with us. I'm going to turn this over to Doug, who has some last minute words for us around how to stay connected. Doug.
Thanks, Alexa. Thank you, John. I knew this was going to be good. Thank you. So we put a couple links there. One to the center that John has started, where you can, I'm sure, find more resources and explore. And we've also put a link up there to a page on our website where we featured this talk and where we are going to post a recording of this. And any other links that we come up with out of this conversation, we'll put them there for you. You're going to get an evaluation. We so appreciate your input, so please look for that and send it back to us. And thank you all.
Friends, as you move from this space, know that you were made for purpose. You may be in the spaces of formation or vocation, somewhere in between the wilderness as we are in Lent. You may be in a space of elation or desolation, but you are always in the sacred space of God's love. So go with God's love to be God's love in the world. Thank you.